The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones of Windsor Castle as Queen Elizabeth II stood in the grand reception room, her experienced eyes surveying the carefully arranged display before her. At 93 years old, she had hosted countless world leaders, but today held particular significance. President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania Trump would arrive within the hour for what palace officials had quietly termed a most extraordinary exhibition. The Queen moved slowly between the glass cases, her walking stick tapping softly against the polished marble floor. Each display contained treasures that told the remarkable story of America's relationship with the British Crown, artifacts that most people never knew existed within the royal collection. These were not merely historical objects, but pieces of a complex tapestry that wove together two nations whose relationship had evolved from bitter enemies to steadfast allies. Lady Sarah Chatto, the Queen's lady-in-waiting, approached with a leather-bound folder. "Your Majesty, the final authentication documents from the Royal Collection Trust have arrived. Every piece has been verified and catalogued according to your specifications." The Queen nodded, accepting the folder with hands that had signed countless state documents and shaken the hands of 14 American presidents before Trump. In the first display case sat a delicate porcelain tea set, its white surface decorated with the American eagle and stars. This was no ordinary china, but rather a diplomatic gift presented to King George III by the first American ambassador to the court of St. James after the Revolutionary War. The irony was not lost on the Queen that the very monarch who had lost America had received this gesture of reconciliation, a bridge between the old world and the new. Sir Edward Young, the Queen's private secretary, gestured toward a mahogany writing desk positioned near the tall windows. "Ma'am, we've placed the Lincoln correspondence here, as you requested. The lighting will be perfect when the President arrives." The Queen approached the desk, where several handwritten letters lay beneath protective glass. These were personal notes from President Abraham Lincoln to Queen Victoria, written during the darkest days of the American Civil War, seeking Britain's continued neutrality and expressing admiration for the British Crown's stance against slavery. The most striking piece in the exhibition stood in the center of the room, a tall grandfather clock whose brass pendulum caught the morning light. This timepiece had belonged to George Washington himself, and had somehow found its way into the royal collection through a series of estate sales and diplomatic exchanges in the 19th century. The Queen remembered her father, King George VI, showing her this very clock when she was a young princess, telling her stories of the American general who had defeated British forces but later became a friend to the crown. Palace staff moved quietly around the room, making final adjustments to the lighting and positioning. Each member had been personally briefed by the Queen herself about the significance of the day's exhibition. They understood that this was more than a diplomatic meeting. It was an opportunity to demonstrate how history, even painful history, could evolve into something beautiful and meaningful. The Queen paused before a display containing a sword with an ornate silver handle, its blade etched with both American and British symbols. This weapon had belonged to General Lafayette, the French aristocrat who had fought alongside Washington against the British, but who had later become an honored guest at royal functions. The sword represented the complex web of relationships that defined international diplomacy, where yesterday's enemies could become tomorrow's allies through understanding and mutual respect. A soft chime indicated that the presidential motorcade had entered the castle grounds. The Queen moved to a tall mirror, adjusting her pearl necklace and ensuring her powder blue dress was perfectly arranged. She had chosen this particular outfit because its color matched the blue in the American flag, a subtle gesture that she hoped the president would notice and appreciate. Through the windows, she could see the black vehicles coming to a stop in the quadrangle. Soon, she would guide President Trump and Mrs. Trump through this carefully curated journey through shared history, helping them understand that the relationship between their nations was built on more than political convenience or economic necessity. It was founded on centuries of human connection, conflict, reconciliation, and ultimately, friendship. The Queen's thoughts drifted to her previous meetings with American presidents. Each had brought their own personality and perspective to these hallowed halls. Some had been formal and reserved, others warm and engaging. President Trump, she had heard, was particularly interested in history and tradition, which made today's exhibition especially appropriate. She hoped that seeing these artifacts would help him understand the depth and complexity of the special relationship between their two countries. As footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, the Queen took one final look around the room. Everything was perfect. The stories these objects would tell could strengthen bonds between nations and remind everyone present that diplomacy was not just about trade deals and military alliances, but about human connections that transcended time and politics. Today, she would share treasures that few people had ever seen, opening a window into a relationship that had shaped the modern world. The heavy oak doors of the grand reception room opened with ceremonial precision as President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump entered, accompanied by their security detail and diplomatic entourage. Queen Elizabeth II stood near the center of the room, her posture erect despite her age, a warm but measured smile greeting her guests. The president, wearing a dark navy suit with his signature red tie, appeared genuinely impressed by the grandeur of the space, while Melania, elegant in a cream-colored ensemble, gazed with obvious fascination at the ornate ceiling and ancient tapestries. "Mr. President, Mrs. Trump," the Queen said, her voice carrying the authority and warmth that had characterized her reign for nearly 7 decades. "Welcome to Windsor Castle. I have prepared something rather special for you today, a collection of American treasures that have found their way into our royal collection over the centuries." President Trump stepped forward, his businessman's eye immediately taking in the impressive scale and obvious value of the exhibition before them. The Queen guided them to the first display case, where the porcelain tea set gleamed under carefully positioned lighting. "This service was presented to my ancestor, King George III, by your first ambassador to Britain after your War of Independence," she explained, her tone matter-of-fact but tinged with the irony of the situation. "Rather remarkable, don't you think, that the monarch who lost the American colonies should receive such a gracious gift from the new nation?" President Trump leaned closer to examine the delicate workmanship, his interest clearly genuine. "Your Majesty, this is incredible. Most Americans have no idea that pieces like this exist. The craftsmanship is extraordinary." Melania stood beside him, her background in luxury goods giving her an appreciation for the quality and historical significance of the porcelain. She asked about the specific patterns and symbols, engaging the Queen in a detailed discussion about the meaning behind each decorative element. Moving to the Lincoln correspondence, the Queen's demeanor became more serious and reflective. "President Lincoln wrote these letters to my great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, during your Civil War. He was seeking to ensure British neutrality, but more than that, he was appealing to our shared values regarding human dignity and freedom." She paused, allowing the weight of the words to settle. "Your nation was tearing itself apart. Yet your president took time to write personally to our Queen, understanding that relationships between leaders could influence the course of history." The president studied Lincoln's handwriting through the protective glass, his expression thoughtful. Lincoln understood something that many politicians today forget, that personal relationships matter in diplomacy. You can't just rely on bureaucrats and formal channels. The Queen nodded approvingly, recognizing a kindred spirit in someone who valued direct, personal communication over institutional protocols. The centerpiece grandfather clock drew gasps of admiration from both American guests. The Queen stood beside it, her hand resting lightly on its wooden case. This belonged to General Washington himself. It somehow made its way to London through estate sales and private collectors in the 1800s. My father showed it to me when I was a young girl, and I've always been fascinated by the idea that it once marked time in the home of your first president. Melania was particularly drawn to the clock's elegant design and asked about its mechanical workings. The Queen, demonstrating surprising technical knowledge, explained how the mechanism had been maintained over the centuries and how palace clockmakers still wound it regularly. "Time connects us all, doesn't it?" the Queen observed. "This clock has ticked through the reigns of 6 British monarchs and 45 American presidents. It has witnessed the birth of your great nation and the evolution of our friendship." As they moved through the exhibition, the conversation became increasingly personal and animated. The Queen shared stories that historians had never heard, anecdotes passed down through generations of royal family members about their interactions with American leaders and citizens. President Trump, in turn, spoke about his own family's immigrant experience and how America had provided opportunities that would have been impossible elsewhere. The Lafayette sword prompted a discussion about the complexity of international alliances. "Lafayette fought against us with Washington, then later dined at royal tables as an honored guest," the Queen noted. "This sword represents something important, that nations, like people, can move beyond past conflicts when they find common ground and shared purposes." Throughout the tour, palace staff observed the easy rapport developing between the Queen and her guests. This was not the stiff, formal diplomatic exchange that many had expected, but a genuine sharing of history and perspective between people who understood the weight of leadership and the importance of personal relationships in shaping world events. The Queen noticed President Trump's particular interest in the business aspects of how these artifacts had been acquired and maintained. She shared details about the Royal Collection Trust, the careful preservation methods, and the complex negotiations that sometimes surrounded the acquisition of historically significant pieces. His business background gave him an appreciation for the logistics and financial considerations involved in maintaining such a collection. As the morning progressed, what had begun as a formal state visit was transforming into something more meaningful. A bridge-building exercise between two leaders who, despite their different backgrounds and styles, shared a deep respect for history and tradition. The artifacts were serving their intended purpose, not just as museum pieces, but as conversation starters that revealed the deep and complex relationship between two great nations. The Queen led her guests to a specially prepared alcove where several previously unseen treasures awaited their discovery. Here, arranged on burgundy velvet, lay items that even the most knowledgeable royal watchers had never glimpsed. The centerpiece was an ornate silver compass that had belonged to Captain John Smith of Jamestown, its needle still pointing true north after more than 4 centuries. The inscription around its rim read, "For new worlds and new hopes," words that had guided the first English settlers to American shores. "This compass represents the very beginning of our shared story," the Queen explained, her voice taking on a storyteller's cadence that revealed her deep personal connection to these artifacts. Captain Smith used this to navigate the Chesapeake Bay and establish the first permanent English settlement in America. When he returned to England, he presented it to King James I as proof of the New World's reality and potential. President Trump examined the compass with obvious fascination, noting how its craftsmanship compared to modern navigation equipment. "It's remarkable that something so simple could guide such momentous change," he observed. "That little needle helped establish what would become the greatest nation on earth." The Queen smiled at his pride in American achievement, understanding how leaders needed to project confidence in their nation's greatness while appreciating the complex history that created it. Moving to an adjacent display, Melania was drawn to an exquisite jewelry collection that told its own story of American-British connections. The pieces included a sapphire necklace commissioned by an American railroad heiress who had married into British nobility, bringing both her wealth and her distinctly American sensibilities to the British aristocracy. The Queen explained how such marriages had created personal bonds between the two nations long before formal diplomatic relationships were fully established. "These gems traveled from the mines of Montana to the ballrooms of London," the Queen noted, worn by a woman who never forgot her American roots even as she adapted to British society. She often said that she was building bridges between worlds, one conversation and one friendship at a time. The conversation turned to more contemporary matters as they examined a collection of items from the 20th century, including a signed photograph from President Franklin Roosevelt to King George VI, taken during the darkest days of World War II. The image showed both leaders in military uniforms, standing together in a display of unity against fascism. Beside it lay the actual pen used to sign the Atlantic Charter, the document that outlined the principles for the post-war world. Your President Roosevelt and my father understood that our survival depended on standing together, the Queen reflected. This pen wrote words that literally changed the world, principles about freedom, democracy, and human dignity that still guide our nations today. President Trump studied the photograph intently, noting the determination visible in both leaders' faces. They knew they were making history, he said. You can see it in their eyes, the weight of responsibility and the certainty that failure wasn't an option. The most emotionally powerful moment came when the Queen revealed a small, worn prayer book that had belonged to an American soldier who died at D-Day. The book had been found on the beaches of Normandy and eventually made its way to the royal collection through a series of circumstances that the Queen described as providential. Inside the front cover, written in a young man's careful handwriting, were the words "for freedom's sake, for home, for the future." This young man from Ohio gave his life on French soil, fighting alongside our boys for principles we all believed in, the Queen said softly. His family donated this to our collection because they wanted something of his to rest in a place where his sacrifice would be remembered and honored. The room fell silent as all present contemplated the weight of that sacrifice and the debt owed to such courage. The Queen then surprised her guests by revealing something completely unexpected, a collection of letters written by American children to various British monarchs over the decades. These ranged from crayon drawings sent to King George VI during World War II to typed letters sent to the Queen herself from American schoolchildren learning about the British monarchy. One particularly touching example was from a class in Kansas whose teacher had encouraged them to write to the Queen after studying British history. These letters remind me that our relationship isn't just between governments or even between leaders, the Queen explained. It's between peoples who share curiosity about each other, who want to learn and understand despite the distances between us. Melania read several of the children's letters aloud, laughing at their innocent questions and genuine enthusiasm for learning about life in a palace. President Trump was particularly moved by a letter from a young American boy whose father was deployed overseas, asking the Queen to pray for his safe return. The Queen had personally responded to that letter, and she shared that the soldier had indeed returned safely. Sometimes, she noted, the most important diplomacy happens in small gestures between individuals who may never meet but who share common hopes and fears. As they continued through the exhibition, the artifacts began to tell a story not just of formal diplomatic relations, but of human connections that transcended politics and nationalism. Each piece represented real people making real choices that shaped the world their descendants would inherit. The Queen's presentation was masterful, weaving together grand historical narratives with personal stories that made the past feel immediate and relevant. The president found himself reflecting on how these historical connections related to contemporary challenges. "Your Majesty," he said, "seeing these pieces makes me think about how every decision we make today will be judged by future generations. These artifacts represent choices that seemed difficult at the time, but created the foundation for everything that followed." The Queen nodded approvingly. "That's exactly why I wanted to share these with you today. History isn't just something that happened to other people. It's the foundation upon which we build tomorrow's relationships and solve tomorrow's problems." The afternoon light streaming through the castle's ancient windows created an almost ethereal atmosphere as the Queen guided her guests to the final section of the exhibition. Here, in a specially climate-controlled environment, lay the most remarkable and previously unknown treasures of the collection. The centerpiece was a leather-bound journal that had belonged to Benjamin Franklin during his time as ambassador to France, containing his private thoughts about British-American reconciliation and his secret correspondence with British intellectuals who supported American independence. Dr. Franklin understood something that many of his contemporaries did not. The Queen began, opening the journal to a page marked with a silk ribbon. He knew that political independence didn't require cultural or intellectual separation. These pages contain his ideas for maintaining scholarly and scientific cooperation between our nations, even as the political relationship was being redefined. President Trump leaned in to examine Franklin's distinctive handwriting, noting how the founding father had methodically outlined plans for ongoing collaboration in areas ranging from scientific research to trade relationships. The journal revealed Franklin's sophisticated understanding of international relations, showing how he had worked behind the scenes to ensure that American independence would lead to partnership rather than permanent hostility. One particularly fascinating entry described his dinner conversations with British scientists and philosophers who secretly admired the American experiment in democracy. These men helped lay the groundwork for the special relationship that exists between our nations today, the Queen explained. Beside Franklin's journal lay an equally remarkable artifact, a detailed map of North America drawn by George Washington himself, complete with his handwritten notes about westward expansion and future territories. The map showed Washington's vision extending far beyond the original 13 colonies, encompassing lands that wouldn't become states for generations. His notes revealed a leader thinking not just about immediate military concerns, but about the long-term development of a continental nation. General Washington was thinking like an empire builder, President Trump observed, studying the map's careful details. He could see the potential of the American continent in ways that most of his generation couldn't imagine. The Queen pointed out specific annotations where Washington had noted potential locations for future cities and trade routes, demonstrating the first president's remarkable strategic vision. The conversation took an unexpected turn when the Queen revealed a collection of items related to American women who had married into British nobility during the 19th and early 20th centuries. These dollar princesses, as they were sometimes called, had brought not only their families' wealth to financially struggling British estates, but also their American attitudes about women's roles and capabilities. The collection included personal letters, photographs, and even business documents showing how these women had influenced British society in subtle but important ways. Melania was particularly fascinated by the story of Consuelo Vanderbilt, who had become the Duchess of Marlborough despite her obvious reluctance to leave America. The Queen shared how Consuelo had used her position to promote women's suffrage and social reform in Britain, bringing American ideas about women's equality to the British aristocracy. She never stopped thinking of herself as American, the Queen noted, and she used that perspective to challenge British assumptions about what women could and should do. The most surprising revelation came when the Queen showed them a small wooden box containing soil from each of the 50 American states. This collection had been assembled over decades by various members of the royal family during their visits to America, with each sample carefully labeled and preserved. This may seem unusual, the Queen admitted with a slight smile, but soil tells a story about a nation's character and diversity that official documents simply cannot capture. President Trump was genuinely moved by this unexpected gesture. "Your Majesty, I had no idea that you and your family had collected something so personal and meaningful. This shows a level of connection to America that goes far beyond formal diplomacy." The Queen explained how each sample represented not just geography, but the people and communities the royal family had encountered during their American travels. As they examined the soil collection, the Queen shared stories about her various visits to America, from her first trip as a young queen in the 1950s to more recent state visits. She spoke about meeting ordinary Americans in small towns and big cities, and how those encounters had shaped her understanding of the American character. "Your people have a remarkable optimism and resilience," she observed. "Even in difficult times, Americans seem to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. The final artifact was perhaps the most emotionally powerful, an American flag that had been carried by the crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger during one of their successful missions before the tragic accident. This flag had been presented to the Queen during a memorial service, symbolizing how the space program represented both American technological achievement and the international cooperation that made such achievements possible. This flag traveled to space and back, the Queen said quietly, representing humanity's greatest adventure. It reminds us that some challenges are too big for any one nation to tackle alone. The president stood silently before the flag, clearly moved by its significance and the tragic story it represented. The emotional weight of the moment led to a deeper conversation about leadership and legacy. President Trump spoke about the responsibilities he felt as president, while the Queen shared insights from her decades of experience working with world leaders. Their conversation revealed two people who, despite their very different paths to power, shared similar concerns about making decisions that would benefit future generations. Melania contributed her own observations about the role of spouses in public life, asking the Queen about how she had balanced personal desires with public duties throughout her long reign. The Queen's responses revealed a woman who had made countless sacrifices for duty, but who had found meaning and satisfaction in service to something larger than herself. As the afternoon progressed, what had begun as a formal exhibition had evolved into a genuine exchange of ideas and perspectives between leaders who understood the unique pressures and opportunities of their positions. The artifacts had served their purpose perfectly, providing a framework for conversations about history, responsibility, and the future of international cooperation. As the afternoon drew to a close, the Queen led President Trump and Melania to a final alcove that had remained covered throughout their visit. With a gesture that was both ceremonial and intimate, she drew back the silk covering to reveal what she had saved for last. A remarkable collection of personal gifts exchanged between American presidents and British monarchs that had never been displayed publicly before. The centerpiece was a handcrafted wooden model of the White House, complete with tiny, perfect details that had been carved by President Eisenhower himself during quiet moments in the Oval Office. President Eisenhower sent this to my father as a personal gift after the war, the Queen explained, her voice carrying the warmth of genuine affection. He carved it himself, working on it during those late nights when the weight of the presidency kept him awake. The note that accompanied it said simply, "From one house to another, with friendship and respect." President Trump examined the intricate craftsmanship with obvious admiration, noting how each tiny window and door had been carved with meticulous attention to detail. Beside Eisenhower's creation sat an equally touching gift, a leather-bound photo album compiled by President Reagan and Mrs. Reagan, documenting their visits to Britain and their friendship with the royal family. The Queen opened the album to show pages filled with candid photographs, personal notes, and even pressed flowers from the gardens at Buckingham Palace. President Reagan understood the power of personal relationships in diplomacy, the Queen observed. He and Nancy treated every interaction as an opportunity to strengthen the bonds between our nations. The most unexpected item in the collection was a small, handwritten cookbook compiled by various First Ladies and given to the Queen during her Silver Jubilee year. The recipes range from Mamie Eisenhower's fudge to Lady Bird Johnson's cornbread, each accompanied by personal notes about family traditions and favorite dishes. This little book represents something beautiful about American culture, the Queen noted. Your First Ladies understood that hospitality and food create connections that transcend politics and protocol. Melania was particularly moved by a handwritten note from Jacqueline Kennedy, written shortly after President Kennedy's assassination, thanking the Queen for her condolences and support during that dark time. The note's elegant handwriting conveyed both grief and gratitude, representing a moment when personal sympathy had transcended international boundaries. Mrs. Kennedy wrote this while dealing with unimaginable personal tragedy, the Queen reflected. Yet she took time to maintain the relationships that her husband had valued so highly. As they continued through this final section, the artifacts revealed the deeply personal nature of international relationships. There were birthday cards exchanged between royal children and presidential children, Christmas ornaments sent across the Atlantic, and even a collection of pressed flowers that various American ambassadors had sent to mark significant occasions. Each item told a story of human connection that existed alongside and often influenced the formal diplomatic relationships between the two nations. The Queen, then, shared something that surprised even her closest advisors. A personal letter she had written to President Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but had never sent. She had kept it all these years as a reminder of how close the world had come to catastrophe and how important personal communication could be in preventing misunderstandings. Sometimes, she said quietly, the letters we don't send are as important as those we do. This one reminded me that in moments of crisis, personal relationships can mean the difference between peace and disaster. President Trump read the unsent letter with obvious emotion, recognizing the weight of the decisions that leaders must make when the stakes are highest. Your Majesty, he said, this shows incredible wisdom. Sometimes the most important thing a leader can do is take a moment to think about the human consequences of their actions. The Queen nodded, appreciating his understanding of the complex responsibilities that came with power. The afternoon's revelations had created an atmosphere of genuine mutual respect and understanding between the Queen and her American guests. The conversation had moved far beyond the usual diplomatic pleasantries to address fundamental questions about leadership, responsibility, and the role of personal relationships in shaping world events. Both President Trump and Melania had clearly been affected by the experience, gaining insights into the depth and complexity of British-American relationships that no briefing document could have conveyed. As their time together neared its end, the Queen made an unprecedented gesture. She presented President Trump with a small, leather-bound notebook containing copies of several historical documents from the exhibition, along with her personal commentary on their significance. These represent our shared story, she said simply. I hope they will serve as a reminder that the relationship between our nations is built on more than political convenience or economic interests. It's founded on centuries of human connection and mutual respect. The president accepted the gift with obvious gratitude and surprise. In return, he promised to establish a similar exhibition at the White House, showcasing British gifts and artifacts in the American presidential collection. Your Majesty, what you've shared with us today will influence how I think about America's role in the world for the rest of my presidency, he said sincerely. Melania added her own thanks, noting how the afternoon had given her a deeper appreciation for the historical foundations of international friendship. She asked if she might correspond with the Queen about some of the women's stories they had discussed, particularly those of the American women who had influenced British society through their marriages and social involvement. As the royal couple prepared to escort their guests back through the castle's corridors, the Queen reflected on how successful the afternoon had been. The artifacts had served their intended purpose, not merely as museum pieces, but as conversation starters that had revealed the deep human foundations underlying international relationships. She had watched President Trump's businessman's "I appreciate both the material value and historical significance of the pieces," while Melania's genuine curiosity had led to discussions that went far beyond diplomatic protocol. The exhibition had accomplished something that formal diplomatic meetings rarely achieved. It had created a genuine personal connection between leaders who would need to work together on challenging global issues. As they walked through the ancient halls of Windsor Castle, all three understood that they had shared something special, an afternoon that would influence their relationship, and, through them, the relationship between their two nations for years to come. The Queen smiled as she watched the presidential motorcade depart, knowing that the afternoon's investment in personal diplomacy would yield dividends in countless future interactions between Britain and America. The artifacts would return to their secure storage, but the relationships and understandings built around them would continue to influence the special bond between two great nations.